Welcome people on Zoom as well. I can't see you, and Amy unfortunately isn't here, so I'm not sure how we can.
But Amy's on Zoom.
Amy's on Zoom, but let's see how we can. If you have questions, send an email to me. Okay, well, that would be great. Is there a computer then? Anyway. Let's start with today's seminar. So I'm really happy that our own Darren Sharp is speaking today. So Daren is a research fellow at MSDI. Started about a couple of months ago, I guess. Daren, for you who don't know him, he's basically working on two projects currently at MSDI. One is around the Net Zero Precinct Initiative, sort of education and research program we are developing around Monash's own investments in net zero operations. And the other part is basically a project he's running together with Shireen and myself. It's a systematic literature review on the water, energy, and food nexus for Melbourne Water. And might have something more coming up after a meeting I might have today, but I'll let you know. But actually, Darren's interest is quite similar to some of my own key interests, which is in urban experimentation. And you finished your PhD some time ago, not too long ago actually, from Curtin University on transformative urban experimentation, and that's what your talk is about today. So Daren, floor shows. Before you start, I should say that I'll have to leave a bit early, about 15 minutes before 2. So I've asked Daren to chair himself the last 15 minutes. Thanks, Daren. Floor shows.
Thank you so much, Rob. And thank you everyone for being here. And hello everyone on Zoom. It's great to have you join us. So I'm going to spend the next probably 35-40 minutes or so giving you a bit of a high-level overview of my doctoral research, which I recently completed, as Rob mentioned, on transformative urban experimentation through Curtin University, which is in Perth. But the research actually took place here in Melbourne. There was a living lab called Live or Yarra, which I helped set up, and we ran that from set up to launch and sort of the whole life cycle. That was over about a year. And then I developed a number of case studies looking at different aspects of urban experimentation. So I'll take you through some of the research, some of the tensions in the literature, the different methods I used, what the findings were, and then wrap it up with some conclusions and next steps and so on. But before I do that, just a bit more about my background. So yeah, I've only joined MSDI recently, and I'm really thrilled to be here working with Rob and working with Shireen and working with the whole team of really talented, passionate, inspiring people, so it's great. Before that, I've been running my own strategy consultancy for the last few years called Social Surplus, working mostly with local government and other public sector actors, trying to essentially activate sharing communities. So I have a strong interest in grassroots innovations and the sharing economy and local sustainability initiatives and how those groups work together and intersect with local government in particular through emerging collaborative governance arrangements and so on. And I'm also the Aussie editor of Shareable, which is a news and action hub based in San Francisco, which has been around since about 2009, which has been doing solutions journalism for a number of years. And I co-wrote a book called Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons, which goes through a whole lot of these emerging case studies and suggests a number of policies for governments and for urban innovators and so on. So to kick things off, I guess it's important for those of you who aren't that familiar with the field of urban experimentation, just to give a bit of background to what it actually is. So essentially it's collaborative. It involves a range of different stakeholders. It involves practice and theory coming together. You've got local governments working with active citizens, working with scholars, researchers in the field, working with civil society, private sector actors as well, undertaking transition governance approaches, a lot of the time through urban living labs, which I'll spend a bit of time talking about, various alternative city futures that are being developed, grassroots innovations, new modes of sustainable urban development. And you can see here there's a couple of key texts which I'd point you to, including The Experimental City, which Rob co-edited, which has some great insights into this emerging field, along with Urban Living Labs, which is a book that Kez McCormick, who you might remember was only here a few weeks ago at MSDI. So Kez has been doing a lot of groundbreaking work on urban living labs, especially in Europe. And there's been a number of research projects that have been funded, a lot of them in the EU, such as GUST, and also Grassroots Innovations has been doing a lot of work. Safang and Smith and others have been doing work in that space as well. So it's an emerging and exciting area of research and practice. So in terms of my thesis work, so I used action research and multiple case studies to really get a sense of how urban experimentation is working across different socio-institutional contexts. So I used action research to build capacity for grassroots agency, essentially to help community members, residents in the city of Yarra reduce their carbon emissions at a household level by making choices to their electricity suppliers, how they deal with food and waste, how they get around, how they insulate their homes, and how they come together as a community to create local place-based support groups. And I'll take you through a bit about that later on. The case studies delved into other aspects of experimentation, including how institutional arrangements shape experimentation in the context of the Future Economies Lab. This is part of a participatory planning process that was led by the City of Melbourne called Future Melbourne 2026. And then I also undertook a comparative analysis of the Sharing Cities Network and Airbnb's Home Sharing Club to understand how urban politics manifests through dynamics of transformation and capture using an emerging area of study called Transformative Social Innovation Theory. And I explored how new urban imaginaries like the sharing city, like the city as a commons, can reframe the context of urban experimentation through guiding visions and alternative transformation pathways. So this begs the question, why urban experimentation? Why should we look at this? I guess it's important to point out that in terms of transition studies, cities have become an important unit of analysis in their own right. So the city is an important site for testing new social practices, new technologies, new governance approaches across a variety of fields, including sustainability transitions, geography, science and technology studies, just to name a few. As this quote from Senges et al. Points out, cities are sites of frantic interaction where multiple socio-technical systems connect, possibly providing opportunities for radical changes when tensions between multiple systems create windows of opportunity for agents of change. That's really hard to represent visually, but I like that photo because it's kind of a bit provocative. But that key point there about multiple systems interacting and creating windows of opportunity for agents of change is something to keep in mind there. So, with over half the world's population now living in cities, they've become a logical transition arena to undertake these kinds of co-creative collaborations, to envision alternative economies, to trial new governance experiments through open innovation systems like living labs. And this brings us to a really important area of transition management, which is a governance process and an operational model for actually undertaking real-world experimentation. There are scholars in this field like Dirk Loorbach from the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, who's been a key scholar in this field. And this work definitely impacted and influenced my thinking in terms of how I approached Live Well Yarra and the action research and understanding sustainability transitions. So the key thing here is to look at, recognising transition arenas, which is a multi-actor governance process with a normative focus on achieving sustainability goals. And the key thing here is that those goals are determined in a co-creative way by the participants themselves. And so this is a process of social learning where people come together to develop alternative visions, alternative agendas and actions, which are often outside of the dominant market or policy logics. Right? And so these transition arenas are about problem structuring. So the transition team usually comes together, and I'll talk a bit more about the transition team that we established for Live Well Yarra, which was made up of academics, community members and local government actors. They generally come together to co-create a vision, a shared agenda and a social commitment to sustainability values. So this transition management approach has been introduced into policy and research for about 20 years now. It started in the Netherlands, I believe, and has been applied in areas of energy, in mobility, agriculture, and housing as well. So I guess my doctoral research was really interested in understanding how urban experimentation can drive transformative change. So transition studies literature suggests that sustainable transformation is required to bring about radical societal change for sustainable development. This can happen through governance innovations, through institutional change, innovation in business, lifestyles and consumption. Evans observes that urban experiments are an important vehicle for not only understanding the city, but importantly for also transforming it. And as McCormick et al. Point out here, sustainable urban transformation places a stronger emphasis on structural transformation processes, both multidimensional and radical change, which can effectively direct urban development towards sustainability. So they make the point here that there's a qualitative distinction between sustainable urban transformation and sustainable urban development. So sustainable urban transformation seeks to catalyze, intensify, or accelerate structural transformation processes to direct urban development towards radical sustainability goals. So, you know, it's alluring to view urban experimentation as a panacea to sustainable urban transformation. But, you know, the concept itself warrants further critical interrogation. So, you know, experimentation involves many complex interactions between different actors, different systems, different institutions with competing visions, competing narratives, different normative goals, and these all shape the purpose and nature of the experiments being undertaken. So this speaks to a number of key tensions in the literature, specifically related to the politics and agency of urban experimentation, which I examined further in my research. So in a special issue of the Journal of Cleaner Production, Hilden et al. Point to the exciting potential of experimentation as a new mode of governance, but caution that it runs the risk of becoming a distraction and maintaining business as usual. So, as I say here, although there is an agreement that experiments can provide innovative participatory approaches to climate governance, questions arise on why and how they emerge, who the agents are, and what the experiments actually achieve. So some pertinent questions arise here around how can urban experimentation bridge the gap between top-down and bottom-up experimentation? How do you evaluate the outcomes of experiments as well? Carvonen et al. Similarly question the role of experimentation as a mode of urban change by asking, what exactly do experiments do? And how do they reframe the notion of sustainable urban development? Do they provide a viable alternative to conventional modes of urban development, or do they simply repackage change in the appealing rhetoric of innovation? So making the connection between urban experimentation and urban politics, Bulkley and Castan-Broto argue that experiments are a critical vehicle to accomplish urban climate governance and take different forms linked to broader contexts of urbanisation and socio-technical systems which establish the opportunities for transformative change. So urban experimentation through transition arenas like living labs and demonstration projects are not always socially inclusive. They can overlook the needs of the communities within which they're embedded, and they often reinforce existing power structures and modes of governance. So my thesis explored how the framing of urban experimentation as having radical potential to drive transformative change does little to ensure the governance processes or structural shifts being sought respond to the needs of the communities within which these change processes take place. Who decides which actors get to undertake experiments, and which visions of urban futures frame experimentation for urban transformation? Google's subsidiary Sidewalk Labs' recent foray into city making through Quayside, the Toronto waterfront redevelopment, is a good case in point, and is really raising a whole lot of tensions between the state actors there, government actors, the community, the public, and the tech sector, all sort of clashing over who has access to this site, how will that demonstration project emerge, who gets access to the data, what role will civil society, the community, and the public have in that space, what happens to the data. There's a whole range of different questions that are being asked about that, along with a whole range of other projects, demonstration projects, living labs, smart cities. These are really pertinent things to get our minds across. As Avelina and Whitmire remind us, to engage with the politics of sustainability transitions requires an understanding of which actors are involved and how their power relations interact and engage. So this discussion leads to another key tension identified in the literature specifically related to the role of agency and grassroots actors in sustainability transitions. So who's familiar with the graphic on the right, or some variation of it. So quite a few hands going up, some not. So the graphic on the right uses the multi-level perspective to illustrate how socio-technical systems typically result from changes in the wider techno-environmental, socio-economic and geopolitical contexts, which create windows of opportunity for radical innovations nurtured in so-called niche spaces or to transform or displace a dominant regime. So a socio-technical perspective on transitions relates to the dynamic relationship between three levels of analysis: protected spaces or niches, where radical social and technological innovations occur, the regime, and the wider context or landscape in which a regime is embedded. However, transition studies provides limited clarity, either conceptually or empirically, on grassroots actors who undertake experiments for urban transformation at the niche level, which makes it difficult to analyse enabling processes of transformation from an actor perspective. As Avellino and Whitmayer observe, most contributions in transition studies which refer to actors are troubled by conceptual ambiguity. Do they refer to specific individuals or individual organisations, to more generalised categories of actors, or to roles of actors? So the nature of grassroots agency, the capacity for agents to undertake experiments for urban transformation at the niche level remains something of an open question in transition studies. Enter grassroots innovation. So this is another emerging field of study, and the literature on grassroots innovation really embeds community action in its investigation of changes at the niche level and provides an important agency-centred analysis on the role of civil society actors in particular as agents of change in transition processes. So we've seen over the last few years a real outpouring in this space, a whole lot of local sustainability initiatives. Through my interest in the sharing economy, I've been really tracking and been involved with looking at the rise of maker spaces, repair cafes, which bring people together with broken goods in local communities and teach each other repair skills, keep goods out of landfill and extend the life cycle of those goods, the rise of urban agriculture, verge gardens, those sorts of things, community energy projects, local currencies and so on. So there's been like a real kind of explosion of local sustainability initiatives and grassroots innovations, which is a really rich field of study for transitions researchers. So grassroots innovations generally respond to local needs. Interestingly, they're initiated by civil society actors, like community groups and voluntary organisations, and they generally have a mix of social and sustainability motives. So grassroots innovation theory provides an approach that recenters the agency of community actors in sustainability transitions, and this opens up the possibility for more transformative interventions at the niche level. So bringing us to my thesis and the action research that was undertaken specifically in Livroy Yarra. So I combined several different methodologies and forms of data collection. The action research itself involved governance experiments with the transition team. So if you go back to that idea of transition management, we had a transition team that was made up of myself and Dr. Rob Salter, who was the project leader, who played a coordinating role in getting the Living Lab up and running and set up. We had community members who were involved as well on the transition team. We had a broader group of community members, residents in the city of Yarra, who took part in a variety of grassroots experiments to lower their household emissions and get more actively involved in their community to promote sustainability. Then we had local government partner, the city of Yarra, and our research funders, which was the CRC for low carbon living. So I used a variety of methods to undertake the action research, including asset-based community development, which is a strength-based approach, and did some asset mapping to try and tease out the strengths of those local community residents and get a sense of where their passions sit most comfortably. So we talk about this in terms of what are their gifts of their head, heart and hands, and trying to surface those gifts or skills or assets and then connect them up so they can then be empowered to undertake a variety of different low carbon actions. I also used participatory co-design and worked with a group who was trying to develop a bicycle project in Yarra to support novice riders with more skilled riders, and so used prototyping to support that community project that they were trying to start. And then evaluation is a critical aspect of living lab projects in particular. And so I used most significant change as a tool to use stories of change from the participants themselves to understand what were the direct impacts of their involvement in the living lab from their own personal perspective. So you can see here, this was the transition team that we set up. This brings back lots of great memories of spending time in places like Carlton and Clifton Hill and Brunswick over the course of about 2014 and 15. We had about a dozen of us. There's Rob Salter in the back, who's kind of crouching over. He was the initiator of the project, and I believe he had like a little community garden that they set up in the street, and that kind of got people talking. Rob had a connection with Curtin and enabled, and got funding from the CRC to start this project, but there was already like a kind of proto group that had formed at a really hyper-local, level between that community at that street level. And so some of these people were actually friends and neighbours who came together to get involved in the running and coordination of Live Well. We then had a lot of community support, especially from the City of Yarra, who provided event space, library space, meeting rooms and promotion through their website, newsletters and other things as well. And they were on the steering group, and we met up with them about quarterly. You can see here an image from Fitzroy Town Hall, which was the launch of Live Well back in March of 2015. And we had about 200 people, and it was launched by the Mayor of Yarra, and we had keynotes from Ross Garno and Fiona Armstrong. So we kind of went through a lot of effort to actually build like a small kind of hyper-local, I suppose, low-carbon movement, as it were, that involved hundreds of people over the course of its lifetime. And we were really trying to create a bit of buzz in the local community, get the word out there. We created a brand, a website, a newsletter, social media channels, videos. We had a professional photographer and videographer come in to help us with that, who donated his time voluntarily. So it was a real kind of, bootstrapping effort with limited funding. And we had the joy, I suppose, of working with so many wonderful and passionate and talented local community members. So you can see here examples of how that grassroots experimentation sort of unfolded and the various shapes that it took. So social learning was a really key aspect of this. And Live Well Yarra provides a good example of how action research can be used to trial enabling processes of transformation through place-based hyperlocal community arenas. And the vehicle we used for that was something we called decarb groups. And they were essentially street-based groups that came together. We had about 10 of them form over the lifetime of the living lab. Neighbours and residents and others who came together in and around Yarra to meet on a monthly basis and to share their low carbon living goals and to support each other through peer-based knowledge sharing. And we had this round the circle activity, which was initiated to get people to share their tips and tricks for how they were draft proofing their home, what they were doing to kind of reduce their dependence on using the car, how they were composting, how they were dealing with waste. And so there was really a great example of social learning in action. And then we also had beyond that, the governance, the experimental governance that was going on through the coordination and management of the transition team that happened within the transition team itself to actually run and operate a living lab, which is, quite a complex and challenging feat, even at such a kind of small scale level. It took a huge amount of work just to get us to launch, and then to actually run the decarb groups and oversee that was a whole other thing. So it was a really rewarding, really challenging experience. And we can see here participants were engaged also through another mode, something called First Thursday Workshops, which was an activity that was generated by the participants themselves. And so we had about 6 of these First Thursday workshops that ran over the course of the Living Lab, where we got experts to come in and talk about the sharing economy, about waste minimisation. We had someone here talking about the divestment movement and how people could divest from their banking and their super away from institutions that support fossil fuels and so on. So there was like a really rich interaction and collaborative social learning environment that was generated where decarb groups would come together at a hyperlocal level, and then we'd kind of meet at a bigger kind of collective, more monthly events where workshops happened, and there were other speakers that were brought in, and then other activities. There was a garage sale trail that people got involved in. There was like a local sustainability festival where we had a stall. So it was like a genuine, you know, community movement that really went on for even beyond the life of the formal research, another few years after that, where little street groups were still running after that as well. So limited research has really been undertaken to date that evaluates the direct impacts of experimentation in living labs using data derived from the personal experiences of the participant community. So I decided to use most significant change, as I mentioned earlier, as a tool to gather stories of change from the participants themselves, to reflect on their involvement in the urban living lab, and to explain to me as a PhD researcher, student researcher, you know, what was the most significant change from their perspective. So this led to some expected answers, others that were just quite surprising. But the beauty of that approach is that it's generative and you don't know where you're going to go when you start, but it enables participants in that research process to tell their own story and to gather data that you wouldn't necessarily have if we were designing a very strict kind of survey or set of questions which doesn't allow for more open-ended, more expansive kind of reflection. So participant empowerment was a critical enabling process in LiveWell, and this manifested through small changes in lifestyle. So these changes included switching to green electricity suppliers, such as PowerShop. So a lot of people kind of moved over. There was, I think, a Greenpeace bit of research that came out ranking all the different energy suppliers at the time, and so people were looking at, you know, comparing if they had solar or if they didn't, which was the best, you know, supplier to go to, what the pros and cons were, and they were supporting each other through that decision making. They also reduced their car usage. They made improvements through home insulation, draft-proofing windows, and so on. There was a lot of talk about how to insulate windows, which type of film to use, the different, you know, qualities of the technology, what they do, what they don't do. Some conversations went on for a long time about the minutiae of draft-proofing and window glazing and little things like that, and how do you use, you know, little, I think they're e-meters to pick up where, like, there's, you know, the parts of your home which are kind of, you know, seeping energy and so on, or drafts are coming through. So there's lots of, you know, really kind of big debates about those kinds of things and how to get the most out of that. Then at the, beyond the individual and the household level, other participants were then empowered to take up more collective modes of action, including group purchasing of rooftop solar. So at the time, there were like community groups that were offering group purchasing. We also had some involvement with the Yarra Energy Foundation, which I believe was modelled after the Moreland Energy Foundation. And they had, I think, an interest in group purchasing, but more from like a commercial point of view. But they were part of that conversation as well, I believe. And then others looked at divestment options more seriously and started talking to their banks and financial institutions. And then one of my favourite stories is of a participant who learned about the City of Yarra's urban agriculture program and the support they provide. And then she was so inspired that she then started a plant-to-box community garden with her neighbours in her street. So there's a variety of small changes that happen at a, you know, individual household, but also more of a collective community level between those residents who are members of LiveWell and actively participated in it. So moving on quickly to the case studies I looked at. In addition to the action research, I looked at research questions on aspects of experimentation, including institutional arrangements, dynamics of transformation and capture, and sharing cities as a new urban imaginary. So this is one of the cases I looked at on the Future Economies Lab, which was a participatory planning process run by the City of Melbourne called Future Melbourne 2026. And I was interested in looking at how alternative governance practices emerge and how urban experimentation can be enrolled as a driver of transformative change with the potential to empower grassroots actors, to support social inclusion, and so on. And I looked at the institutional arrangements for this particular project and how through the design of the engagement there were various settings in terms of how the community were consulted that could, on the one hand, empower people to have a say in the future vision for the city, to develop the city's future 10-year community plan, but also had not necessarily the intended consequence of reinforcing top-down governance and policy logics, and really just more of a business as usual rather than more of a radical and transformational path. And I'll talk a bit about how that relates to some of the choices that were made in terms of the, if you're familiar with the IAP2 spectrum of public participation, where at the very far end you've got empower, and how often a lot of participatory planning processes, they talk about empowerment, but they don't actually walk the talk. And I would argue that this is something that actually manifested in this particular case study here. Another 5 minutes? Yeah, sure. So the findings were from this particular case study showed that people could come together to design prototypes for alternative city futures, but that the institutional arrangements are really critical here to understand how you can empower grassroots actors. And then I looked at what was happening in places like Bologna and elsewhere, where there's more co-creative process settings, where power is shared between active citizens and council. So in Bologna's case, there's much more collaborative forms of urban governance going on, where citizens can actually propose projects to council, and they'll sign collaboration pacts, which are like legal instruments for institutional and structural change at that grassroots level between citizens and local council. The next area I looked at was around dynamics of transformation and capture, to understand how civil society actors remain vulnerable to capture by centres of power. So I used transformative social innovation theory, and this provided a link between social innovation and transition studies. So it looks at how different agents of transformative social innovation work together to create new social relations, and they innovate through new forms of doing, organising, framing and knowing. And I looked at a comparative analysis I undertook between the Sharing Cities network, which has been spearheaded by Shareable, which is a grassroots network of civil society actors who come together to run asset mapping workshops, to essentially connect the dots at that really hyper-local level to provide visibility around, where are all the car sharing spaces, the community gardens, the tool libraries, the repair cafes and so on. And I looked at and contrasted the narratives of change that they were developing and the modes of grassroots mobilisation that was being developed within civil society. And I then contrasted that with how Airbnb, in their interest to defeat Proposition F, which was a bit of legislation that was proposed to cap the number of short stays in San Francisco a couple of years ago. I looked at how Airbnb, as a private sector actor, co-opted to a degree the Sharing City language and narrative of Shareable and the Sharing Cities network, and used similar grassroots mobilisation tactics. They also threw $8 million at that campaign, and off the back of that, they really went full steam ahead using political campaigning tactics to develop this home sharing clubs movement, which was a way to train up and skill up hosts and guests of short stay accommodation, so they could then lobby on the corporate platform's behalf. So looking at how those narratives of change and grassroots mobilisation can be co-opted and how they co-evolve between civil society actors and private sector actors. The last aspect of the research here was really around changing opportunity contexts of transformation. So I looked at the Sharing City as a new imaginary of urban transformation that prefigures alternative social practices, modes of collaborative governance, and that challenges neoliberal pathways of economic growth, deregulation and privatisation. So Sharing Cities is another sort of concept and narrative and vision and imaginary that's been pioneered by the likes of Shareable. It's been taken up by a number of city governments, including Sharing City Seoul, Amsterdam Sharing City. As I mentioned, I contributed to the book that is available, Sharing Cities Activating the Urban Commons. So this imaginary essentially looks at the city through a new kind of lens, a new vision, a new set of alternative practices and governance approaches and so on. And it's being enacted to some degree in cities already. So at a grassroots level through the Sharing Cities network, at more of a local government level through like a major capital city through Seoul, which has invested millions of dollars in their Sharing City program. And they've also opened up over 800 of their public buildings for use by the community during idle hours. Amsterdam has gone down a similar path, and Seoul is also investing in their local sharing startup ecosystem through funding and support, and they've made changes to their policies and regulations to support domestic sharing. So I examined how new urban imaginaries can really reframe and restructure the context within which urban experimentation takes place. And to do my analysis, I used the diverse economy framework pioneered by the Community Economies Collective. Is anyone familiar with the work of Gibson, Graham, Catherine Gibson, Jenny, Stephen Healy, Take Back the Economy? It's worth having a look at that work. So I did an interpretive analysis of how new urban imaginaries reframe the context of urban experimentation through different readings of the economy that recenter the agency of grassroots actors, reimagine the governance of cities through alternative market and non-market transactions, paid and unpaid labour, and reciprocal modes of exchange and commenting practices. So just to wrap up, because I'm keen to get some questions and have some feedback and discussion. So to answer my original research question, how can urban experimentation drive transformative change towards sustainability? So action research can enable grassroots experimentation and social learning in the context of the Urban Living Lab Live or Yarra through small-scale transformation at a personal, household and community level. Participatory evaluation methods like most significant change create opportunities for Living Lab members to share their stories of change, for action researchers to evaluate the direct impacts of experimentation and reflexive governance from an actor-centric perspective, importantly. And this foregrounds the personal experiences of participants in these projects, of which there is a significant gap in the field. Local government can and does play an important role in shaping urban experimentation through institutional arrangements, which I've talked about, that can both empower transformative change, but also disempower grassroots actors through process settings that reproduce existing governance logics. And then more co-creative process settings using collaborative urban governance could support community empowerment in collaborative planning processes. Dynamics of transformation and capture manifest as both civil society and private sector actors come together and they co-evolve both narratives of change and grassroots mobilisation tactics, which raises challenges for urban policymakers who are seeking to distinguish genuine grassroots change from corporate lobbying efforts. And new urban imaginaries can reframe the context of urban experimentation through guiding visions and alternative pathways that enrol a wider range of urban actors and practices to both drive transformative change, challenge neoliberal framings of the economy, and recenter the agency of grassroots actors and create new social realities. So here's some light further reading for you. If you want to follow up any of that, my PhD thesis has just been published through Curtin University's institutional repository, so I expect a full report for everyone next week, just kidding. But if you want to have a look at the publications that really form the basis of my thesis, because it was a thesis by publication, you can have a look at the 5 publications there which are available. Combination, there was 1 conference proceeding, 3 journal articles, and 1 book chapter which is due to come out next year. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks, Darren. Taking the fact that I'm the chair and I have to leave in a few minutes, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a quick question myself first, and then actually hand it over to you to chair your own Q&A session. I think this is a really important area, also not in general, but specific also for MSDI, because I think what you've done in the Liberal Yarra example, for instance, really adds sort of, I think, a specific capability, expertise to MSDI, right? Because you're really good in working with policy and industrial kind of stakeholders, industry kind of stakeholders, and trying to influence those. We're really good at thinking through interventions for changing behaviors and sort of think about what sort of conditions could enable those interventions. But what you're adding, I guess, is to really work from the bottom up with communities, which we don't necessarily address all the time in our projects and programs. Maybe RISE is a different example there. But so I think that really adds to it. But I guess my question is, from your experience, what sort of is the key capability that comes with being able to run these living labs in the way you did? What is key to being able to do that in a successful way?
you know, I mean, some of that is born of trial and error and what we could have done differently, and if we had more time, more money, and all those sort of things. But I mean, in a nutshell, I think the key is to not reinvent the wheel. I think be inspired by, you know, operational processes like transition management, which have a really good kind of guiding framework around how you bring community actors together. So I think, you know, you can use that as kind of like a base sort of process, and then, you know, add other things from your own toolkit. So in my case, it was, you know, community economies thinking and asset-based community development. So have like a really strong structured process, and to co-create the shared agenda and vision with participants from day one, I think is critical, because a key thing that comes out in the Living Lab literature, and which emerged in ours and in I think almost every Living Lab, is governance challenges around, you know, leadership and ownership. So how do you get that balance right between steering and controlling, which comes out in the literature? So how do you, as, you know, academic researchers who are, you know, critical to the success of the project and want to get your data and have deliverables at the end of it that you can, you know, point to and see the project come to its fruition, you know, you're working with community members, so they have often different agendas and different interests. And so it's kind of like learning how to speak in those other languages to be a bridge between the community members, your funders, and local government actors, so that you can play that translation role and make sure that it's as co-creative as possible, which is easier in theory than in practice.
Yeah, just to add to that, I guess that's where my thinking was going as well when I was asking this question. I'm still involved in 2 living labs in the Netherlands as well, where I would say these are around smart cycling innovation, and I would say we have mostly failed to involve the local communities in these labs. So, and I've reflected a little bit on that, but I think it's partially because we didn't. There's a capability needed in order to be able to work across sort of the formal sectors of policy and industry and governance, and the informal sectors of civil society and communities, and it needs to be done in a deliberate way. And if you don't do it, sort of, at least my experience is that I then fall back to the formal sectors that I'm comfortable with, rather than working with the communities directly.
One tip is to kind of, it maybe sounds a bit trite, but to serve the communities that you're working with. And so it's kind of like putting your own interests a little bit in the background and not speaking like an academic. People were kind of given the, you know, the ethics sheets and the participant information statements to sign and to get involved with, but then it wasn't like, you know, they could come and talk to us about it, but we didn't go in there talking about this as like, you know, and today for the action research, we're doing this, and this is the data I'm gathering now. It's like, it really felt like a community group. And we met in libraries and town halls and, you know, neighborhood houses and those sort of things. So it was about trying to serve their interests, put the community interests first, and then, and then play that translation role. So it's tricky to get the balance right.
Got a lot of our questions, but I'm going to hand it over to you. Don't forget to use the mic.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks a lot, Rob.
I'm sorry for running out.
No problem.
Thanks, Darren. And really interesting to see, you know, all those different cases. But I have a question about, you know, the scaling, you know, and so are there many examples of these things really scaling, or is it not really the point? Is the point for them not really to scale, to sort of really become sort of a new norm, or because it seems like many of because you refer to like Live Well, you know, in this Living Lab, you know, as temporal. I mean, it had a begin and end, and you know, and so what now? What happens to it? You know, or is it sort of always just these kind of small things that make some other change? Or you know, so I just want to get a bit sort of really the you know, the theory of change as it sort of maps onto, you know, traditional transitions thinking that sort of, you know, eventually, you know, the niches grow and merge to almost become the new regime or the new norm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was really influenced by thinking of people like Ezio Manzini and notions of design for social innovation. So rather than looking at this in terms of scaling up, I kind of approached it more around scaling out. So looking at how do you replicate and connect. And I've really been inspired by the repair cafe movement, the Little Free Libraries, the urban agriculture movement globally, and look at how they don't you know, scale up in that kind of sense that you're talking about. But in 10 years, repair cafes went from like an idea in the Netherlands, and there was one, to now I think there's over 1,000 of them all around the world. And you know, the secret I think there is that they have a really simple message and story. They have toolkits to enable other people to copy what they're doing, and they make themselves easy to be copied. So they're not commodified. So with repair cafes, for example, you can just go out and get the toolkit and start your own repair cafe in your own community and get support from you know, the kind of global office in the Netherlands. Office is probably like a little, you know, meeting room, who knows what it is. I make it sound much bigger than it is, but you get what I'm saying. And so you can't have these trans-local networks that they may not necessarily have a whole lot of visibility to, you know, the mainstream, but people, if they want to seek these things out, they can get access to them and they can replicate them. So then it's about almost having this like patchwork of local sustainability initiatives that are existing in, you know, communities where there's energy to get those things started. And that's the tricky part with living labs and demonstration projects, is they often do just kind of, you know, peter out once the funding goes and so on. And we see that happen all the time. And I mean, I think it's instructive to look at what's happened in Malmö in Sweden, where they've taken this approach, and they talk about it in terms of infrastructuring, which I think is trying to overcome some of those limitations. And I guess it's linked with this idea of public innovation places and how you can use, you know, especially local government as like an anchor institution, as an enabler to create an environment where, like in Malmö, they've got a whole lot of living labs, they've got a whole lot of infrastructure for sharing, making and repair, which the local government has supported, and they work with the local university there. And so I think, you know, local government councils can play a really strategic role in keeping those places going. And infrastructuring, what it is essentially is like ongoing continuous public innovation. So like City of Melbourne have a city lab and so on, but the idea is to have it as an open door where the community is just constantly coming in and you're working on, you know, how do we get Melbourne to net zero by 2030 or whatever it is. And then people are, you know, there's experts there, people in co-design, people with data, you know, other scholars and practitioners, whatever, but it's a collaborative effort and it doesn't have a fixed time frame. So I think I'd like to see more of that kind of ongoing continuous innovation happening. It's much easier said than done though. I don't know if that answers any of your questions.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I definitely learned a lot from that. But a couple questions. But the one I wanted to ask was when you were mentioning about the kind of tensions that there can be with inclusiveness, and that there are also kind of tensions around community engagement, or that those are two aspects that are often not brought into such research. And I was wondering if those two things are ever in tension with one another, whether or not. I guess it's really evident that you are very proactively engaging community, but I wondered whether inclusiveness was still a kind of barrier or something that you thought to reach out beyond the people who were sort of naturally drawn to the project and were really proactive in seeking out and participating in some of these activities. And I just wondered if you felt like yeah.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I think, and this came out in sort of reflecting on the process of the Living Lab, that there's a real need, I think, for stronger facilitation skills. So especially when we had a tiny little team of myself and Rob running the Living Lab with about 10 or so other community members, we needed to have a distributed model where others could come in. So that's more like a skill level around facilitation. But I think the reason I'm pointing to that is I think that could address those issues of inclusion. That has to be baked into the design of the program, though, I think, in terms of the norms that you're trying to establish and the values that you're trying to uphold. So with Live Well, it was just open to whoever had the energy and the interest to get involved. With the Future Melbourne stuff, like the Future Economies Lab, that was a combination of invited stakeholders to those workshops and then general public. So there was an attempt to kind of keep it open to a degree, but have some other, kind of experts or, known stakeholders that could be in the room to provide their input as well. So, no, but I'd like to kind of interrogate that notion of inclusion further, because I don't have a clear answer as to how to get that right. Because often, especially at that hyper-local level, it's whoever shows up and who's got the time and interest to, you know, come along on a cold Thursday night in Melbourne to talk about compost or whatever it might be. So, yeah, but facilitation skills, I think, can help, you know, ameliorate any kind of, if there's louder voices in the room and you're trying to bring in those more softly spoken people or others who are afraid to kind of, you know, stand up in front of a group of people or whatever. I mean, I think that can potentially overcome some of that, but then there's the broader how you structure the process to be more inclusive strategically, which I don't have an answer to, but it's an important thing to consider.
So my question is, who defines the agenda? Like, who sets up the fact that we need to talk about compost, or, and I guess also, like, depending on the lab, the priorities will change and the topics will change, but how do you get into that process?
So in the case of Live Well, Rob Salter was the visionary behind that project, and he initiated it and got the funding for it and got the group up and running. So he had a pretty strong vision of what he wanted Live Well to do. And then it was a matter of bringing people in, and they then shaped that agenda going forward through those transition team meetings. So there are about a dozen of us that met regularly who were kind of like, there were people that came in and out of that, but there was a kind of core group of about a dozen. And those people had a pretty strong say over, you know, the topics that wanted to be covered, the people that we could bring in as experts to help. And then, but there, again, there were tensions around needing to do an academic project and try and get people to reduce their stationary energy and transport emissions, and then speaking to and enabling and empowering the needs of those community members. So it was often done through dialogue and through literally just people sitting down at, you know, library meeting rooms or town hall, community halls, whatever it was, and just, you know, having those kind of discussions over a couple of hours every few weeks and to try and plot it out. It can be a difficult, messy process. But then what did emerge was those first Thursday workshops, and that was an idea from one of the group, and that person then went off and just had free rein to invite speakers and suggest topics and so on. And then other people brought in, like if there were other events or workshops or other things council were doing, people would just freely share it. We had like a newsletter that went out as one vehicle to communicate that, social media channels, the website. So people could post things, they could share things, and they were talking to each other. And yeah, so, but you know, there is that tension around, like I said earlier, steering and controlling, needing to do the action research, but also needing to make sure that community participants' interests and are being heard and met. So, yeah. Should we check if there's anyone with a question online? Anyone on Zoom? Can you hear us on Zoom? Any questions? I think they just talk. Yeah. I think they can just turn their mic on. I hope. I don't know how to check.
There's no computer.
No. Okay, last chance. Any last burning question? Okay, one more, yeah.
I was curious about when you were talking about the trying to get people into an innovative mindset, but at the same time that your answer earlier about not reinventing the wheel. And I was wondering whether there's I was wondering whether people feel like they're looking to external resources for answers to questions, or if they feel like they're sort of creating the answers to the questions in their community.
Well, I mean, that's one reason why I used strengths-based approaches like asset-based community development. So that really tries to work from people's own experience and skill base. And so one of the ways we did that was through the asset mapping workshops that I ran, where people could talk about their ability to fix bicycles, or to, they know a lot about composting, or, how to repair things, or how to insulate their home, or what they did with their solar. So we really tried to tease out and leverage that knowledge that was kind of implicit in the group, and then use that as a starting point for conversations. And then when we could identify gaps in that, knowledge base through that kind of social learning environment, then we'd bring experts in who could kind of fill that as needed. So that, and that could have been people from council, it could have been practitioners, it was a range of people that kind of interacted with the various groups over the course of the Living Lab. And the same thing with co-design. It's like, prototyping with those communities so they can develop their own solutions collaboratively together. So I try to use those more strength-based tools as a method to really draw out people's strengths. So yeah, but there's, as I said, there's so many ways you can kind of structure these sort of processes, and different tools that you can bring in and try out. Thanks. Cool. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I'm around if you have any more questions. I could talk about this stuff all the time. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, and thanks everyone on Zoom.
Thank you.
Amy, are you there?